Okay, it's been almost half a century since the late 60s wave of hippie communalism sparked scholarly interest in intentional communities and communal societies, leading to the birth of organizations like the International Communal Studies Association. During that half century of scholarship, people have debated the causes of communal longevity and success, and have debated whether longevity and success are even appropriate categories for evaluating intentional communities. When I began my own research on communities 2 decades ago, I had already made up my mind that longevity was irrelevant. The point of a community is to create an exciting, transformative place now, and to spread its influence in the larger society, whether that lasts for 6 months or 6 years or 60 years. I was so sure of that that I made it the central argument of my book, Touching the World, about Camp Hill and Catholic worker communities, even though both of those movements had already achieved remarkable records of longevity. They were both founded in the 1930s, and so were well into their 3rd generation when I started that research, and are moving into the transition into a 4th generation today. And that kind of longevity was almost inconceivable to the scholars writing in the 60s and 70s, at a time when Camp Hill and the Catholic worker were only about in their 2nd generation. And those scholars generally, situated oftentimes within the hippie communal experience, tended to look back to the 19th century when the vast majority of intentional communities started in the US, lasted for only a couple years, barely more than, very few of them more than a decade. Now that we're 2 decades into the 21st century, the history of 20th century communalism, with its wide range of more enduring communal impulses, is well worth our attention, and it raises new questions about longevity. Today I'd like to share some of my recent work on Camp Hill by offering 2 hypotheses about communal longevity. The first is not original to me, and it is, for communal studies scholars, so obvious that it's hardly worth discussing. The single most important factor in communal longevity is celibacy. As thousands of years of Buddhist and Christian monastic history make clear, communities of women and men who refrain entirely from sexual activity are much more likely to endure. And notice how this is kind of counterintuitive. Communities that do not produce the next generation are much more likely to endure into future generations. Most likely this has more to do with the absence of family ties than the absence of sex. Families have a tendency to compete with communities for the loyalty of their members. And even if a community is a good fit for a family at one stage of its development, oftentimes the family will find that it needs a different living situation at a later stage of development. Monastic communities also benefit from their symbiotic relationship with larger religious traditions in which most people are not celibate, but in which the celibate few are accorded special honor and recognition. Still, celibacy is not an absolute prerequisite to longevity, as the survival of several non-celibate communities founded in the 1930s makes clear. Since Camp Hill is one of those non-celibate, family-embracing communal movements, I'll have no more to say today about my celibacy hypothesis. My second hypothesis may be more surprising. The second most important factor in communal longevity, I think, is the refugee experience. Communities that are, at least in their early years, composed primarily of refugees are more likely to endure than those that are not. This hypothesis occurred to me as I reflected on the history of Camp Hill in light of the current worldwide backlash against refugees. So I'll be reflecting for this hour on the relationship between the refugee experience and communal longevity, thinking about what this tells us about communities, but also what it tells us about how people living in communities today might think about our current refugee crisis or challenge, though that's more of an invitation to all of you to think about that. Okay, oh, there's I was supposed to show you the cover of my book before, and there's what I was supposed to be showing you when I was talking about monastic. Buddhist and Catholic monastics. Okay, now
There we go.
Okay. By far, the most enduring refugee community is the Hutterites. How many of you are familiar with the Hutterites? Okay, so the Hutterites are the fully communal cousins of the Amish. This is a communal group that today comprises 500 villages, 45,000 people, mostly scattered across the upper plains and mountains of the United States and Canada. They're the largest non-monastic communal movement in North America. Hutterite history has been shaped by 4 distinct refugee experiences. So they began in 16th century Switzerland, where they were among a number of groups that rejected the practice of infant baptism and the idea that the church and state are intimately intertwined. And that was very threatening to society at the time. So all of the Anabaptist groups, Mennonites, Amish, as well as Hutterites, were subjected to severe persecution. All the leaders and founders were killed. So Jacob Hutter and his group fled from Austria to Moravia. As the Austrian Empire expanded, they fled in the early 18th century with just 100 people to Ukraine at a time when the Russian policy was to make farmland available to anyone who wanted to farm it. When their Russian neighbors became intolerant in the 1870s, 400 communal Hutterites migrated to the Dakotas. As pacifists, they resisted the draft during the First World War. 2 Hutterites died in military prison during that war, so they crossed the Canadian border in search of refuge, as many people are doing today. With the advent of laws respecting conscientious objection in the U.S., they began to plant new colonies in the northwestern United States as well. So those are the Hutterites. Though the Hutterites only arrived in North America at the end of the 19th century, America's earlier communal history can also be traced to Central Europe. Oh, there's the Hutterites moving around. Okay, here's Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. In 1722, he welcomed a group of religious refugees to his estate, where they established a village known as Herrnhut. Zinzendorf himself was part of the Pietist movement, a Protestant impulse emphasizing heartfelt devotion. His guests were the remnant of a late medieval reform movement among Czech speakers founded by Jan Hus. And for those of you who are Unitarian Universalists here, the flaming chalice symbol has a very loose sort of echo of the Hussite movement, which was based in part around the idea that the lay people as well as the priest should be able to drink the wine at the Eucharist, a very fitting principle for a gathering of this sort. So Zinzendorf's own spirituality and that of his guests mingled together to form what we know of as the Moravian tradition. Fired with missionary zeal, the Moravians planted semi-communal villages in North America and the Caribbean and inspired a host of other communal groups that began in Germany, experienced varying degrees of persecution there, and relocated to North America in search of greater freedom. So if you have an Amana refrigerator or washing machine, that traces to this particular phase of communal history as it was transplanted to Iowa. And there's several other groups like that. Throughout the 18th and into the 19th century, Moravian and Moravian-like groups were the clear majority of non-monastic communal groups in North America. In the 20th century, the power of the refugee experience was confirmed by the notable success of the kibbutz movement which welcomed Jewish refugees from persecution in both Europe and the Middle East. The kibbutzniks achieved a dual success. They simultaneously established a communal culture that was robust enough to last for generations and helped lay the foundations for the new state of Israel. Today, about 270 kibbutzim are home to 100,000 residents, making them the largest non-monastic communal movement in the world, I think, although it is always dangerous for communal studies scholars to think that they know things, because when you go to our conferences, there's usually somebody who knows something. In 1972, the sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kanter published Commitment and Community, a study of 19th century communalism that categorized communities as successful or unsuccessful entirely on the basis of longevity. And she made 30 years the dividing line between successful and unsuccessful. She then charted the presence or absence of various practices, concluding that the successful communities were more likely to practice the commitment mechanisms of one, sacrifice, such as celibacy, investment, such as holding all property in common, renunciation, such as being isolated from your neighbors, not being allowed to talk to your neighbors, a practice that the Lavra doesn't have, for example. Communion, such as shared labor, and mortification, such as ritualized confession of sins to one another. She implied that any community could increase its chance of survival by adopting a large number of these commitment mechanisms. But perhaps she made things too complicated. All 9 of her successful communities required their members to renounce family life, while only 6 of 21 unsuccessful communities did so. So the celibacy factor alone may have accounted for much of the difference. 5 of the 9 successful ones were German pietist groups that had fled persecution. A 6th was a German Catholic group, and a 7th, the Shakers, had a founder who had come to the US as a religious refugee from England. Only 2 of her 9 successful communities lacked a significant refugee story. And it's notable that those 2 had a fairly dubious claim to success. They lasted 30 years, barely, because they had very long-lived founders. They both collapsed with the deaths of their founders. By contrast, only 3 of her 21 groups, of her 21 unsuccessful groups, had a refugee experience in their history. And a closer look at her roster of commitment mechanisms reveals many practices that are either a logical corollary of refugee status, such as speaking a foreign language or sharing a common religious commitment, or easier to impose on a group of refugees, such as working together without compensation. So it seems reasonable to conclude that celibacy and refugee status alone can account for the differences in communal longevity, and that a group that employed most of Kanter's commitment mechanisms but was not celibate and did not have a refugee experience would not be likely to endure. I underscore this point because many people who are attracted to intentional community, I suspect many of you here today, are not attracted to Kanter's commitment mechanisms. You wouldn't want to live in a community that expected you to promote negative stereotypes about your neighbors, for example. Many people yearn for economic cooperation, ecological sustainability, and a deeper connection to other people, but would prefer not to have to sacrifice personal freedom, especially intellectual freedom and the right to form families, in order to achieve those goals. From Owenite and Fourierist communities of the 19th century to the hippie communes of the 1960s, vast numbers of short-lived communities have held out the promise that one need not choose between community and freedom. The short lifespans of these communities are often held up as evidence that one really does need to choose. By holding up the refugee factor for our examination, I hope to kind of complicate that sort of stark way of putting it. And I hope to do that because there's a really important ethical dimension here. Typically, non-refugee communities that enact Cantor's commitment mechanisms are dominated by charismatic authoritarian leaders. People who restrict individual freedom in order to cement the loyalty of their followers. If people who yearn for community imagine that they have to choose between true community and individual freedom, they're more likely to succumb to the authoritarian leader who says, you have to choose, follow me, give up your freedom, and at least you'll have a community that will endure for the rest of your life. That promise is a false one. If you look closely at Cantor's data and lots of 20th century cases, you discover that although highly authoritarian structured communities like Oneida in the 19th century, may live longer than the freedom-loving communities, they almost never outlive their founders. Shorn from the refugee context, intense commitment mechanisms typically have less to do with loyalty to the community and more to do with loyalty to that one individual founder. And in the absence of that person, both the commitment mechanisms and the community fall apart. So I don't know what exactly that says for those of you who are not refugees wanting to create enduring communities. I don't have any great secret about how you can endure, but don't imagine that regimentation and sacrificing of freedom is some kind of golden bullet for that. Okay, this is my... Though the refugee dimension of the Hutterite pietist and kibbutz stories should be obvious to any observer, it occurred to me only as I was reflecting on the communal movement I know best, Camp Hill. This is one Camp Hill community. Camp Hill is one of the largest and most enduring intentional communal movements in the world today, but publicity is not its strong suit. How many of you were familiar with Camp Hill before you came to this tonight? Okay. Publicity is not the strong suit. Camp Hill is a network of several thousand people living in about 100 villages, schools, and other communities worldwide. Camp Hill places bring together people with and without developmental disabilities, usually in agrarian settings that feature craft workshops, gardens, and farms, as you can see. Camp Hill is inspired by the spiritual teachings of Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian, okay, that got a few more nods of recognition, an Austrian who was active in the Theosophical movement before creating his own movement called Anthroposophy. Anthroposophy combines Western esoteric traditions of alchemy and astrology with Buddhist notions of karma and a reimagined version of the Christian liturgy. Drawing on what he claimed as clairvoyant spiritual experience, Steiner offered teachings about education, agriculture, economics, medicine, architecture, dance, and care for persons with special needs. These teachings gave rise to such initiatives as Waldorf schools, biodynamic agriculture, and Camp Hill communities. Camp Hill is particularly noteworthy in that it tries to combine lots of different aspects of Steiner's teachings. The primary emphasis is on his guidelines for work with people with disabilities, but Camp Hills are also organized in line with his teachings about economic cooperation, and often host Waldorf schools and biodynamic farms. The original Camp Hill places in Scotland also host an anthroposophical clinic and a team of Camp Hill architects, because Steiner had particular architectural theories. Steiner provided Camp Hill's founders with a rationale for organizing on a cooperative communal basis. Life sharing in common households reflected his stress on the healing potential of person-to-person encounters. So people with and without disabilities, families and single people are living in shared households. While the practice of income sharing stemmed from Steiner's view that wage labor turns people into commodities. Camp Hillers also quote Steiner's fundamental social law, according to which the the well-being of any community will be enhanced, the less each individual claims for themselves the proceeds of their work, and the more each person's requirements are satisfied by the work of others. Sorry for this fuzzy picture gotten off the web. About half of all Camp Hillers are children or adults with developmental disabilities. About a quarter are young co-workers in their late teens or early 20s who volunteer for a year or two. And the remaining quarter are adult co-workers who are there along with their children and have made a long-term commitment to Camp Hill. To those groups, one might add the employees, non-residential students, and disabled adults participating in day programs who swell the Camp Hill population in many places during the daytime hours. No one knows for sure how many people live in Camp Hill today. My own estimate is roughly 5,000 full-time residents. This is above the peak population achieved by the Shaker movement, often seen as the most successful 19th century American communal impulse, which had begun to decline by the time it reached Camp Hill's current age of 78. By 19th century standards, Camp Hill would qualify as an astonishingly long-lived communal movement, but it's part of a cohort of 20th century movements that have shattered assumptions about communal longevity based on 19th century data. The Catholic Worker Movement and the Bruderhof are two other movements founded in the 1930s, also still thriving today. Unlike most other anthroposophical initiatives, Camp Hill was not directly founded by Rudolf Steiner, but by a circle of friends who had discovered anthroposophy in Vienna around the time of Steiner's death. A few of them were medical doctors with an intense interest in Steiner's teachings on work with people with disabilities, a practice that was rapidly being undermined in territories under Nazi control at the time. Most of these friends, unlike the majority of other anthroposophists, were ethnically Jewish, though all were personally committed to the anthroposophical version of Christian practice. For these reasons, they were under grave threat when Hitler occupied Austria in 1938. They scattered, pledging to regroup as soon as possible, and that pledge was fulfilled in Scotland, where a wealthy benefactor provided them with an estate called Camp Hill, on which to found a school for children with developmental disabilities. The women, and so this is the founder group basically, the women in this group moved into the house just as World War II was beginning. The men were interned, the married men on the Isle of Man, the unmarried men in Canada, as foreign alien nationals, whatever the term was, by the British government until the British government concluded that they were safe. So this is kind of parallel to the Japanese internment camps in the US, but it didn't last nearly as long. But by 1941, they were fully reassembled and the community was underway. Karl Koenig, the leader of this group, later described the first Christmas he spent as a refugee with these words: "Alone, a drop in the vast human sea of a city, a stranger, a foreigner. I knew that with me tens of thousands of people shared the same fate. Men and women, old and young, children and adults, we were all in the same boat. It was the boat of loneliness, a ship without a destination, a life uprooted from the native soil and barely saved, like a plant which is given a handful of earth in a little pot of clay." In this evocation of the refugee experience, Koenig drew on powerful biblical images of Noah's Ark, seeking a place of refuge in a flooded landscape, and of a precious seed that carries the promise of the future. Though Camp Hill was shaped most profoundly by the founders' experience of being refugees from Nazi-occupied Austria, they were refugees in a few other ways, and these also contributed to the communal strength of Camp Hill. Co-founder Tilla Koenig, one of the few in the founding group who was not ethnically Jewish, was ethnically part of the Moravian tradition. She brought that heritage of Count Zinzendorf and his own hosting of refugees into the Camp Hill movement. At the time of Camp Hill's founding, moreover, all the founders were, in a metaphorical sense, refugees from the Anthroposophical Society itself. This was the consequence of a schism that happened shortly after Steiner's death. Koenig and the others had never known Steiner directly. They discovered anthroposophy through the work of Steiner's most influential student, Ida Wegemann, who had established her own school for children with special needs in Switzerland in 1924. In the 1930s, Wegemann and one ally clashed with the other 3 members of the Society's Executive Council, who accused her of claiming too much spiritual authority for herself. That fight was not unrelated to the rise of Nazism. Wegemann was an outspoken critic of fascism and a mentor to several anthroposophists of Jewish descent. Shortly after expelling her, along with the entire British and Dutch branches of the Society, the remaining 3 members of the Executive Council issued a statement affirming that Steiner himself had been of pure Aryan heritage and began a period of collaboration with Nazism. If you ever hear the phrase green fascism or eco-fascism, it's referring a lot to the strand of Nazism that was really intrigued by things like Steiner's biodynamic agriculture. From Koenig's perspective, true anthroposophy was thus expelled from the Anthroposophical Society at the same time that the true spirit of Middle Europe had been expelled from Vienna. Campbell's task was to provide a place of refuge for both. And indeed, Campbell succeeded in holding that other side of anthroposophy several decades until the factions were reconciled, and one of Koenig's granddaughters is actually now on that same leadership group that had kicked Ida Wegemann out 80 years earlier.
Wow.
Partly as a substitute for membership in the Anthroposophical Society, Koenig organized his companions into a quote-unquote inner community committed to mutual accountability and shared spiritual work. So an example of how those commitment mechanisms flow from refugee experiences, in this case, the more metaphorical refugee experience. For the next decade or two, Camp Hill retained a strong refugee sensibility. New volunteers came mostly from German-speaking countries, many of them now fleeing the communist government of East Germany rather than Nazism. These new arrivals, in some ways, were even more deeply shaped by the refugee experience than the founders had been, for they had known nothing but war since they were young children. Only a handful of non-disabled British people joined the communal movement growing up in their midst. Of course, many British people with developmental disabilities did join Camp Hill, and they brought yet another refugee experience into the movement. Early in the 20th century, it was common practice for children with disabilities to be separated from their parents and placed in large and neglectful institutions. Camp Hill offered these children a safe home and an alternative sense of family. As the children grew up and graduated from the original Camp Hill school, it became clear that the larger society was still not ready to include them, and so Camp Hillers began organizing villages in which adults with and without disabilities would share life and work. The sense of shared endeavor was palpable in the early days of the villages, as everyone, regardless of ability, had a role to play in erecting houses and establishing farms. Since the residents with special needs were less likely to move from one village to another or leave Camp Hill altogether, over time they became the most experienced communitarians in the movement, the resident experts on the story and customs of each local community. And if you go to a Camp Hill place today, almost invariably the people who've been living there the longest are people with special needs. Camp Hill, in short, has a history very much like that of the Hutterites and Kibbutzim and Moravians and Pietists, a history in which repeated refugee experiences coincide with a deep and enduring sense of community. So now I'm going to ask why. What is it about the refugee experience that makes a community likely to endure? One important factor is that refugees rarely have good alternatives to living in community. If they don't speak the language of the surrounding community, they need to maintain close and cooperative connections to the handful of others who do speak their language. Perhaps they're not allowed to seek employment in their new country. Perhaps they've previously lost all of their individual or family property and don't think all that much about trying to accumulate individual possessions again. Put crassly, the opportunity cost for living in community is lower for refugees than for most other people. Now, this aspect of the refugee experience adds a nuance to the preferred 20th century label for a communal movement, intentional community. This phrase implies a distinction from the traditional community in which accidents of birth determine who is and is not a member. The members of intentional community, so the notion goes, are there only through active intentionality. They could be someplace else, but choose to be here. This is only partially true for refugees, and in Camphill's case, for people with developmental disabilities who may have been placed in community through the initiative of parents or social workers. The necessity of the refugee gives ballast to the free-floating intentionality of the volunteer. The difference in opportunity costs can be illustrated by comparing refugee communities to the 19th century Fourierist movement, the movement that Amy will be writing her dissertation on. The Fourierists, American communitarians who drew selectively on the utopian theories of Charles Fourier, established a few dozen communities in the US in the 1840s and 1850s. Most of them were US-born, middle-class idealists. As historian Carl Guarneri has suggested, they marketed themselves as a communal alternative that would not force participants to forsake any of the freedoms they enjoyed as Americans. The consequence was that participants in Fourierist communities continually monitored their opportunity costs, flocking to community during the Depression, leaving during the subsequent recovery. If a Fourierist community struggled economically, its members did not hesitate to jump ship. But if it thrived, they sometimes voted to privatize their assets and realize the profits of their collective labor. Not surprisingly, Fourierist communities were so short-lived that they were popularly referred to as four-yearites. Many of them thought those 4 years were the best 4 years of their lives. Another strength that refugees bring to community is the fact that they often carry a cherished vision of the society they've lost and hope to recreate. Thus, Karl Koenig never broke faith with what he regarded as the true spirit of Central Europe, epitomized in the Vienna of his youth. He referred to Camphill as a seed of social renewal and encouraged Camphillers to preserve aspects of Central European culture. One consequence of this is that most Camphills have a distinct look and feel to them. Indeed, a common game among English-speaking Camphillers is to try to discern which aspects of Camphill are about Camphill, which are about anthroposophy, and which are just part of the general culture of the German-speaking world. A third strength that refugees bring to community is a bit paradoxical. Refugees are people of privilege who apply their privileges to the task of building community. To clarify this point, it may help to note the formal distinction between refugees and internally displaced persons, as defined by the United Nations. So I'm coming back to that question. An internally displaced person is anyone who loses their home because of violence, persecution, or war. In order to become a refugee, you have to cross an international border. Only then are you eligible for protection by international law and the economic aid made by the United Nations. Only a third of the 65 million people displaced in the world today qualify as refugees. These people, and especially the ones who've crossed multiple international borders to make their way to countries substantially more privileged than the countries where they started, are the most privileged segment of the larger population of displaced persons. Many of them started out with economic or educational resources that allowed them to travel far distances from home. And once they arrive at their destination, they have sponsors governments, nonprofits, private individuals eager to provide them with support. The founders of Camp Hill became refugees a decade before those definitions were formalized, but they enjoyed both sorts of privilege that I've just described. Most were educated professionals, including several doctors, and they were already part of the international support network that is the anthroposophical movement. The vast majority of Central European Jews did not have these advantages and were not able to escape the violence of Nazism. Once they'd arrived in the United Kingdom, Camp Hillers found wealthy sponsors who, enthralled both by their vision of care for persons with disabilities and by their refugee story, offered large estates as the sites of community. As a consequence, life in Camp Hill can bring the opportunity to live on a stunning seaside estate where my daughter saw her first rainbow. That's in Northern Ireland. You can live in a castle, or in rural villages, such as the ones in New York that regularly host the finest classical musicians from New York City. To some extent, the strengths that refugees bring to intentional community last only as long as the first generation. But there are a few ways in which those strengths persist. The refugee generation, through a contribution of their own hard work and the financial gifts of their sponsors, often succeed in putting a fledgling community on a solid economic footing, lowering the opportunity cost of life in community for the non-refugees who will follow after. You don't need to know how to make your own tiny house in order to live in a Camp Hill today, even though the founders did a lot of house building. Second, the boundary between the refugee generation and those who come after is fuzzy, as the share of community members who've been refugees declines gradually over time. So refugee-based communities don't suffer the same abrupt shock that is suffered in charismatic authoritarian communities with the death of the founder. The transition can be extended even further, as is the case for Camp Hill and also for the kibbutzim, if a significant number of newer members are also refugees, either literally or metaphorically. And the strengths of the refugee community can extend further still if the community maintains such a distinctive culture that its members continue to experience themselves as refugees vis-a-vis the surrounding culture, even those who've lived their entire lives within the same community. This, as I suggested earlier, is one of the most important keys to Hutterite endurance. Of course, not every intentional community movement would lift up the Hutterites as a model to emulate. Hutterites have endured by sealing off their communities from the surrounding culture, preserving their values by relinquishing the opportunity to share those values with anybody else. For a movement like Camp Hill that aspires to be a seed of social renewal, such an approach is unacceptable. And that brings me to the next part of my argument. Just because the refugee experience has been the key to longevity for movements like Camp Hill, does not make it the fount of every blessing that intentional communities have enjoyed. On the contrary, I believe that the refugee experience is so central to communal history that it's the source of much that is right and much that is wrong. For Camp Hill today, the refugee ethos is a significant source of dysfunction, both internally and externally. Internally, this takes the form of a generation gap between those shaped by the refugee experience and those who came later. Probably through the end of the 1950s, the majority of long-term non-disabled Camp Hillers were refugees from Nazism or communism. Beginning in the 1960s, and especially in the 1970s, a new stream of free-spirited cosmopolitan volunteers, people who'd grown up in the prosperous societies of Western Europe and the United States, came seeking the same things that hippie communalists came to hippie communes seeking. These newcomers admired the refugees for their endurance and hard work, but also chafed under the rigidity of the traditions they had established. Ultimately, the difference between those generations was not great enough to threaten the survival of Camp Hill. Compared to many communal movements, Camp Hill has weathered generational transitions with grace. Karl Koenig's death did not create much disruption, in large part because he had dispersed authority among multiple other members of the founding circle years earlier, and those individuals in turn dispersed their leadership roles to ever wider circles over time. And still, significant tensions persisted. During the 1980s and 1990s, most Camp Hill places went through a period of intense conflict, typically focused on the question of whether to preserve Camp Hill traditions unchanged or adapt to new circumstances. In many cases, the conflict was resolved only by the departure of some or all of the combatants, with many founders of individual Camp Hill places forced to leave the communities they had founded. Remember that castle? Everybody, all the non-disabled people living there had to leave simultaneously in the 90s because they couldn't get along with one another. And it's run much more like a conventional kind of social service agency now as a result. Members of the refugee generation, who had often compromised the well-being of their own children in order to devote long hours to the community, wondered why the newcomers insisted on protecting family space and family time. Newcomers admired the old-timers' depth of commitment, but wondered why they were so dogmatic. Or in some cases, the roles were reversed. Old-timers wondered why the newcomers were acting like refugees even though they weren't. A less obvious generation gap divided the Camp Hillers with developmental disabilities. Early on, many of them had minimal contact with their families of origin, who were not encouraged to play a significant role in the life of the communities. Today, by contrast, the parents of persons with special needs can be an integral part of the organism of Camp Hill life. An increasing number of Camp Hill communities are located in urban rather than rural neighborhoods, and parents who reside nearby may be weekly or daily visitors. So the place in North Vancouver, every other person that I met was actually there as a parent. It's not obvious to me that that difference has generated significant conflict, but I do think that Camp Hill places have been slow to fully embrace the gifts that extended families can bring to an intentional community. So very few of those parents that I met in North Vancouver ever had any occasion to visit other Camp Hill places or see themselves as part of the future of the movement. The internal conflicts are accompanied by significant external challenges. Communities dominated by refugees tend to experience the larger society as a threatening, dangerous place, and thus to erect high physical and metaphorical boundaries, even where there's potential for more neighborly relationships. Historically, Camp Hills have been located in isolated rural areas on self-enclosed properties that can feel like a world unto themselves. They did not initially do much to build deep relations with their rural neighbors. Indeed, the very prosperity engendered by the refugee ethos can create an additional barrier with neighbors in economically depressed rural areas. So I was talking about New York's Hudson River Valley. This is a place where, in general, people with a somewhat kind of Appalachian cultural heritage coexist with the vacation homes of Manhattanites. And Camp Hill can often look like just another manifestation of that Manhattanite vacation home phenomenon. So, while it may be that the refugee experience is a key to a community's survival during its first generation, one of its central developmental tasks in subsequent generations is learning how not to live like refugees. And making that argument, I'm building on that developmental communal hypothesis of Donald Pitzer. I don't think I have a picture of him yet. Oh yeah, this is from, oh, I think this is maybe more fabulous locations. That the key to communal history is creating ever more pliable social, economic, administrative forms with each new developmental stage. In order for communities to transcend their refugee roots, they must change their culture as well as their personnel. Because intentional communities thrive best when they're populated by refugees, They tend to construct their residents as refugees, even if those residents aren't really refugees. This can make intentional communities pleasant places to live for people who, for whatever quirky reason, feel like refugees from mainstream society. But it makes them at least a little bit uncomfortable for people who don't feel like refugees. People who are emotionally close to their families of origin, people who have religious, artistic, cultural, or professional identities that are anchored in the institutions of mainstream society. Communities that live like refugees, moreover, may be vulnerable to the same sort of mistrust or hostility that society directs towards actual refugees. It's another good. So, I invite you to think with me about the ways that enduring intentional communities can evolve beyond their refugee roots so as to engage more freely and openly with their neighbors. And I also invite you to consider ways that intentional communities of whatever developmental stage might make common cause with the refugees of today, with the Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, Sudanese, and Yemenis fleeing war and fundamentalism, with Central Americans fleeing poverty and gang violence, with all the people who will be displaced by climate change, and perhaps with workers who are displaced by automation and changing economies. The challenge is to hold the two tasks together, to open one's doors to newly arrived refugees and to the neighbors who've been here all along. If intentional communities fail to do that, if they embrace new refugees while continuing to shun their neighbors, they may simply feed into the patterns of distrust and hostility that create refugees in the first place. For Camp Hill, the current developmental challenge has less to do with the generational transition from World War II to the baby boomers, which occurred decades ago, and more to do with changes in the refugee status of persons with developmental disabilities. In 1939, it was fairly obvious that they were refugees from mainstream society. By demonstrating that such people could, with loving support, be productive, resourceful, and happy members of thriving communities, Camp Hill helped initiate a society-wide change in attitudes. 3 generations later, the parents of people with special needs no longer feel they must send their children away from home. Many prefer to keep them living at home for their entire adult lives. Many churches, schools, neighborhoods, and businesses welcome people with special needs as active participants in public activities. The change is imperfect and incomplete, to be sure, but the word refugee is no longer an apt description of the relationship between persons with developmental disabilities and the larger society, at least in the West. And to the extent that Camp Hill is still structured in ways that presume its disabled residents are refugees, this creates a host of problems. Here in the US, these problems are encapsulated in a federal document with an ominous title: the final rule issued by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services governing the placement of persons with developmental disabilities in home and community-based services. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds of disability policy, but I hope you'll see that this has relevance for the topic of intentional community. So this rule defines what it means for services to be provided in the community as opposed to in an institution. And Medicaid and Medicare desperately want for all of their services to be provided in the community. The rule, crafted in close collaboration with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network and other disability rights organizations, requires any program receiving funds for services in the community to guarantee participants integration into the larger community, choice among a variety of settings, individual rights, and as much personal autonomy as possible. All things that Camp Hill strives to provide. But it also contains a passage that describes what in the community is not. And that passage reads as if it were designed specifically to exclude places like Camp Hill. Farmsteads or disability-specific farm communities, gated secured communities for people with disabilities, and residential schools are all described as typically having the effect of isolating people from the broader community, even if they're designed specifically to bring people with and without disabilities into intense community together. It appears that Camp Hill is not the primary target of this section. The crafters of the policy were reacting to a trend among wealthy parents of people with autism to create farms or communities intended to shelter their children from the stresses of mainstream society. But the effect is potentially devastating to Camp Hill, since even the practices that Camp Hill has been adopting in responses to calls for mainstreaming, such as the creation of smaller communities within urban settings, still fall well outside the final rule's definition of in the community. So the essential logic here is that an intentional community cannot be in the community. This is why the final rule should be of interest to anyone who studies intentional communities, not just those interested in communities with a mission related to disability. The final rule contains echoes of many previous episodes in the history of communalism. Karl Marx's critique of utopian socialism was in many ways a rejection of the refugee mentality found at Camp Hill. If people are being treated unjustly by mainstream society, the response is to fight mainstream society, not to create a place of refuge. There were similar tensions when ex-Fourierists got involved in labor activism, similar tensions between the hippie movement of the 1960s and more overtly political groups like the Weather Underground. I don't think there's yet similar tensions between eco-villages and climate justice activists today, but perhaps there will be as both of those impulses become stronger. So I got a foretaste of some of these challenges last summer when my family and I arrived here at Boughton Village on the day of the Brexit vote. Boughton is located in England's North Yorkshire moors, and it holds a special place in the Camp Hill movement as the first Camp Hill community for adults with special needs, and until recently the largest Camp Hill community in the world, with 300 residents, its own post office, grocery store, church, Waldorf school, publishing house, 4 separate farms, training seminars for various anthroposophical practices, and a few successful businesses. The landscape of Great Britain is actually dotted with newer Camp Hill places founded by former Boughtonite. Boughton occupies a classic setting for an intentional community. It's almost at the center of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park. Sheep of many flocks mingle freely on the high moors and on any road you try to drive down. Boughton is nestled on both sides of a valley between the moors. From almost any place in the village, one can look across the valley to locations a mile or two away that are still part of Boughton, but one can see very little of the world beyond Boughton. And there's my daughter looking across at the rest of Boughton. The entire property was once a summer residence of British Minister Harold Macmillan, who donated it to Camp Hill so that his son Alistair could become one of the founding villagers, people with special needs. There's his house.
Oh, pretty.
It is tragic, but not especially surprising, that Boughton is the epicenter of the current struggle over the future of Camp Hill. It's currently divided into 2 hostile camps. This is one of the camps. On the one hand are the majority of long-term co-workers who are committed to the traditional Camp Hill practices of life sharing and work without salaries. On the other side are managers hired by the overarching charity, Camp Hill Village Trust, who believe that a more conventional employment structure is needed to preserve Camp Hill's access to state funding in a time of austerity. A few long-term co-workers have taken this side, believing that Camp Hill needs to evolve in order to survive. Villagers with disabilities, short-term co-workers, and employees find themselves caught between those factions. It's not my intent to pass judgment on the conflict. I've not spent nearly enough time at Boughton to do so responsibly. Nor do I wish to draw an easy parallel between the conflict within Camp Hill and the conflict, largely related to refugees, that was raging in British society at the time of my visit. In fact, perhaps the only point of agreement between the 2 groups of Camp Hillers is that both of them were horrified by Brexit.
What is CVT?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's Camp Hill Village Trust. That's the overarching charity that wants Barton to abandon its traditional life-sharing practices and do things in a more conventional social service way. So the Camp Hillers are all horrified by Brexit, but the vast majority of their neighbors were voting for Brexit. North Yorkshire is one of the most pro-Brexit places because it is a rural community that has not seen the benefits of globalization. And that's the crux of things. Barton, like so many intentional communities in the US, past and present, is a prosperous and cosmopolitan community of refugees tucked in an economically depressed rural area. The local authorities, including the authorities responsible for the care of persons with disabilities, don't trust Camp Hill. Several years ago, they placed a moratorium on the placement of new villagers at Barton, which is part of the reason it's no longer the largest Camp Hill in the world. All the controversial changes enacted by CVT represent an attempt, only partly successful, to regain the goodwill of the local authorities. And that's occurring in the context of conservative government budget cuts that are supported by Barton's North Yorkshire neighbors. It's hard to blame Camp Hill Village Trust for doing whatever it can to keep Barton afloat in a hostile environment, and also hard to blame Barton's neighbors for being at least a little suspicious of a community dominated by outsiders, many of them well-educated with access to outside financial resources, on an estate that was given to them by a British Prime Minister. The good news is that the crisis has forced both sides to reach out to their neighbors. As the community of long-term co-workers has diminished, Camp Hill Village Trust has had to look locally for new employees, doing a tiny bit to reduce the chronic unemployment of the region. Some of the long-term co-workers who were forced out of Barton have moved only as far as the next town. I don't think I have a picture of them in the next town, sorry. Where they now manage a local health food store as the economic hub of what they hope will be a revitalized traditional Camp Hill community. Some of their most important allies are neighbors, usually from the professional classes, who have taken sides for them in the community, including both a local Anglican priest and a doctor who discovered that the health outcomes for people with special needs at Barton were way above the national average under the traditional model, but were in steep decline with the changes that were being. In short, what's beginning to happen, perhaps 60 years too late, is that Barton's neighbors are beginning to take an active interest in what does or doesn't happen at Barton. And Camp Hillers are proactively seeking out relations of neighborliness. Many, perhaps most, of the Camp Hill communities founded in the past few decades have deliberately eschewed the Barton model of rural isolation in favor of urban communities that are embedded in small cities or suburban neighborhoods. I mentioned earlier the isolation of the Camp Hill places in the Hudson River Valley, but today that's offset by the work of these folks at Camp Hill Hudson, which maintains 2 houses and a lively gift shop in the city of Hudson, which is a classic Rust Belt community that's experienced significant economic decline. On the outskirts of Belfast, in Northern Ireland, Camp Hill Holywood operates a thriving coffee shop that is a favorite volunteer site for local teenagers, some of whom also participate in environmental education programs at the larger, more traditional agricultural communities nearby. And here's the local mayor doing his turn in the Holywood coffee shop. Mm-hmm. The bridge community in Ireland takes its name from the bridge that is at the center of the town of Kilcullen. In addition to maintaining a centrally located coffee shop, the bridge is home to a farm and nature trail that allows its neighbors to get their exercise while walking between the River Liffey and the community's houses, gardens, and livestock pens. Interpretive signs introduce visitors to the Camp Hills values, ecological principles, and folk wisdom. What's more, the whole thing was built by a team of volunteers from Fidelity Investments, forging an ongoing tradition of cooperative volunteering between Camp Hill and its neighbors. Another Irish model of community engagement is the Kilkenny Collective for Arts Talent, also located in a small town center. This isn't a residential community at all. It's an art center that offers studio space, a theater troupe, and classes to persons with disabilities and other disadvantages. Founded in 1999 with support from the European Union, KCAT has been consistently successful at gaining grant support from beyond the anthroposophical subculture, and it maintains a high profile in its local community by sponsoring regular arts festivals for its neighbors. There's the studios. There's one of their festivals. In a sense, Camp Hill Hudson, Camp Hill Holywood, The Bridge, and KCAT all represent a repudiation of the insular, refugee-oriented culture of early Camp Hill. In a deeper sense, though, they represent the fruition of the refugee heritage, because Camp Hill would not be in a position to reach out to its neighbors if its refugee founders had not first laid a solid and enduring economic and cultural foundation. This point is even more evident when we consider those Camp Hill places that, in reaching out to their neighbors, have also forged creative ties to today's communities of refugees and immigrants. And I'm going to conclude with two stories of Camp Hill's interaction with actual refugees and immigrants today. Camp Hill Viderosen, located a couple hours train ride from Oslo, is the oldest and largest Camp Hill place in Norway. Like Botten Village, it has a thriving farm, extensive gardens and greenhouses, and enough land that residents only occasionally catch a glimpse of the world beyond Camp Hill. Like Botten, it's part of an overarching charitable trust that has had to make some compromises to the traditional Camp Hill mode of community, though it's done so without nearly as much conflict. One such compromise is that the non-disabled residents of Viderosen are all classified as employees who receive wages, though they do continue to do the life sharing of common households. And this is another Camp Hill where you can see a rainbow. My daughter only sees rainbows when she's at Camp Hill. Viderosen's embrace of the employment model had an unanticipated consequence. A large share of its employees, especially those with the nursing training needed for life sharing with elderly persons with disabilities, are immigrants from the Philippines, Nepal, and several other countries. Unlike the Western volunteers who populate most other Camp Hills, these immigrants do not come primarily seeking community. They just hope to earn enough to send a remittance to family back home. Viderosen's hybrid economic structure, in which many employees live in life-sharing households with their daily needs met, are perfectly suited to the practice of sending remittances back home. Your needs are met, and you get a paycheck, you send it home. What's more, many of these immigrants find it easy to adjust themselves to community life, which isn't that different from the tightly integrated rural villages in which they grew up. The Norwegians and other Westerners at Viderosen have, in turn, embraced the distinct gifts of their immigrant companions. At the time of my visit, all the energy in the community was focused on the construction of a simple house that was intended as a pilot for a service project in Nepal, because several of the Nepali Camp Hillers were from a village that had been impacted by that earthquake several years ago. And the plan was to build a home alongside local people so that everyone involved would develop home building skills. We'll go back to the rainbow. While engagement with immigrants emerged organically at Viderosen, it's the founding mission of House of Peace, a Camp Hill-inspired community in Ipswich, Massachusetts, about 25 miles north of Boston. The permanent residents of House of Peace are adults with and without developmental disabilities who together have the task of offering short-term hospitality to families whose children have traveled to the United States for medical treatment for injuries sustained in war. This mission reflects the complementary personal histories of its founders, Carrie and John Schuchart. Carrie spent many years living in Camp Hill Village, Kimberton Hills, a traditional village community in Pennsylvania. One of Kimberton's longtime leaders, Helen Zipperlin, was famous for encouraging volunteers to follow their hearts into new vocations, even if it meant leaving Camp Hill. And Carrie was one of those who took Helen's guidance seriously. John, for his part, is a longtime pacifist who briefly lived with the Bruderhof and then was one of the Plowshares 8, a group of activists who went to prison for using hammers to damage nuclear warheads at a General Electric plant in Pennsylvania. Together, Carrie and John have fostered a model of community that can relate with equal ease to the resistance communities inspired by Daniel and Phil Berrigan, to the anthroposophical movement, and to their well-heeled suburban neighbors in Ipswich. House of Peace also made it into the news recently when one of the Syrian families they've hosted found themselves separated by President Trump's travel ban. Obviously, we're living at a time of great danger for refugees, not only here in the United States, but in every place that has been impacted by the rising tide of nationalism, intolerance, and fascism. The intentional community movement, which in many ways owes its very existence to refugees, has an obligation to play an active and constructive role in this time of crisis. Some have suggested that intentional communities are needed today to exercise the Benedict option, to withdraw from the larger society and preserve a more humane culture while the rest of the world goes to hell. My proposal, drawn from the Camp Hill experience, is just the opposite. Every community that has been blessed by the gifts of refugees and achieved a measure of stability and prosperity has an obligation to stop living like refugees, an obligation to open its doors both to its neighbors who are refugees and those who are vulnerable to the appeals of anti-refugee demagogues. Only through such openness will the seed preserved by Karl Koenig and his friends find its fullest flowering. Thank you.